to the diplomatic corps, to our invited guests, to ex-ambassadors in South Africa. I remarked to the High Commissioner that it could almost be a meeting of the United Nations, everybody here today. And Donald, to say that it was a year ago about that I stood here and announced I'd be running for leader. Little did I know that the 3-month race that it was supposed to be would turn into a year-long race. And I remarked, I think, to somebody the other day that I'm 44 years old, and I was relatively exhausted after a year-long campaign. I don't quite know how Donald Trump and Joe Biden have managed to battle it through for their year-long campaign. But it's really great to be here today, and it's also really wonderful to see my excellent friend, somebody who I grew up in politics at his knee, Ambassador Tony Leon. And it's great to have you here, Tony. And I was the other evening at a function with Tony, and I described the history of the DA, and as you know, Tony was the first leader of the DA. So I said, well, Tony Leon was Genesis chapter 1. Helen Ziller was Genesis chapter 2. I skipped very quickly over Exodus, and I'm now here and hope it's not going to be Revelations. Colleagues, as we grapple to come to terms with the post-COVID, post-lockdown world, it's crucial that we don't let one crisis mask an even bigger one. And we do not let the extraordinary events of 2020 leave us confused as to which one came first and which is the more serious problem facing South Africa. The truth of the matter is South Africa was in desperate trouble long before COVID was anything more, or Corona was anything more than a Mexican beer that you shared with friends on a Friday night out. And while most of the world, indeed, and most of our African neighbors bounced back from the various maladies of the global financial crisis in 2008, we've been on a path of steady decline during then, well over a decade, that has had nothing to do with outside forces or acts of God. And if anything, I think what the pandemic has done is shift attention away from the looming crisis in our economy and our society. It's given us all something else to worry about first, before we get back to that other thing that had us so worried before we entered the lockdown. And crucially, given those who made zero headway with our faltering economy a very convenient scapegoat to blame for all our current woes, current and historic. We're now led to believe that had it not been for the arrival of coronavirus in March, we wouldn't be in this mess, and that our turnaround, which was just about to happen, has now been set back by years. This is all nonsense, of course, and anybody who has any thinking ability would recognize this. By March of this year, before the first South African had tested positive, and before the first lockdown restriction announced, we were well into a deep economic recession. And, most importantly, there was no sign of a turnaround on the horizon. We'd been relegated to junk status by the ratings agencies. SARS was missing very key revenue collection deadlines, and the state-owned entity dinosaurs were gobbling up multi-billion rand bailouts at the expense of just about every other real government responsibility. None of that had anything to do with the first the virus or the lockdown, although they have all been made infinitely worse from it. Every part of our decline, our dwindling GDP, our ballooning unemployment, our rising national debt, our falling tax revenue, and our parasitic state-owned entities, and our apparent insistence on repelling all international investment is entirely self-inflicted. Despite our rich natural resources, our incredible infrastructure, our well-developed mining, agriculture, banking, and tourism sectors, and a massive untapped and eager workforce, we've been lagging way behind our African peers for well over a decade. And we're doing so because of a stubborn refusal of our government to let go of an economic ideology that fizzled out and died in the rest of the world over 3 decades ago. The Berlin Wall might have fallen, the Soviet Union crumbled, and entire economies were reinvented and built from scratch, but our government here is still fighting this ideological war, like that lone Japanese soldier isolated on a remote Philippines island for 3 decades after the Second World War had ended. The belief that the state must be central to the economy, to the lives of the citizens, and that the state must own the land, the industries, and the monopolies, and that the state knows best where and how economic activity should be directed, is and remains the single biggest impediment to our progress as a nation. Yes, there are many other issues as well, and corruption is one of them, crime is another. But this is even rooted in, these problems are rooted in this unique worldview, where many cadres of the liberation movement consider material reward to be the justified spoils of victory in war. Smuts Ngonyama was dead serious, an old friend of Tony's from Parliament. He was dead serious back in 2004 when he said, and I quote, "I didn't join the struggle to be poor," unquote. And, with respect, I think he's spoken for many of his colleagues in the interceding decades. But government corruption is a symptom of the state-obsessed ideology. And you cannot solve it without obviously moving the massive incentive to loot a massively inflated and ineffective state through patronage and tender fraud. In short, what South Africa needs desperately now is sweeping reforms, a new agenda, a new horizon. We need to start reforming every single aspect of the state by taking power away from government, the incapable state, and putting more of it in the hands of the people of South Africa from whom it has been taken. You need to make the switch and understand that private sector, the private enterprise, are not the enemies, and they're not the problem. The smart entrepreneurs and investors know far better than government does how to fill the needs in the market, and they are far more efficient at delivering goods and services. Just a fortnight ago, Elon Musk, who, like many of us in this room, is South African, surpassed Bill Gates as the second richest man in the world through his company Tesla. And the question we should be asking ourselves is, would Elon Musk have been able to unleash the power of Tesla and the revenue of Tesla had he remained in South Africa? I would advance that with our incredibly destructive labor regime, with a government that is obsessed with red tape and control at every turn, it made it impossible, which is why South Africa has lost entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, like Mark Shuttleworth, and so many others who've had to go and hatch their dreams on far-flung continents rather than right here in their home country. We need to also admit that running power companies, airlines, broadcasters is not government strength or primary focus. When these operate at a massive loss, the opportunity cost of them is absolutely devastating to our economy. Let's just look at South African Airways, for example. We're about to spend upwards of 18 billion rand on yet another bailout for South African Airways. That money has come from cutting frontline services, but it also comes at a massive opportunity cost. And to save the small number of jobs at South African Airways, we're potentially shrugging off the potential to create hundreds of thousands of new industries and new jobs right here in South Africa by using those billions towards youth entrepreneurship programs, funding education opportunities at both the basic and higher education, seed capital for entrepreneurs, giving it to cities to get powerful hubs of innovation. That is the opportunity cost. And we're essentially robbing the future of young South Africans to hang on to this ideological obsession of a state-owned airline that has not made a profit, will not make a profit, but remains a vainglorious testament to this clinging ideology that the governing party can't shake off. We also need to realize that the market and international investors don't care about the backstory of South Africa. We're very proud of it. We think we're exceptional. But to the other countries in the world and to investors around the globe who look at us as an investment destination, that doesn't matter very much. And when we look at the investment deterring policies being preceded, the horsemen of the apocalypse, national health insurance, nationalization of the Reserve Bank, expropriation without compensation, all these things are massive deterrents to the very investors we need to be thrusting open our doors to invest here in South Africa and help to grow our economy. This, coupled with an inflexible labor market, a volatile government policy approach, are deal breakers to most of these countries who don't mind taking a risk, but would not be mad enough to invest in a country where they see no future and no security. All of these areas can and need to be reformed if we're going to see results. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that this is a simple task. If it was, it would have been easy enough to do it a long time ago. It's rather like trying to turn a massive oil tanker. It doesn't happen easily or quickly. But the truth of the matter is we've hardly even begun to start turning the wheel yet. We have a government that does a lot of talking about the need to start doing so. But what we actually need is a government that's going to grasp it. And so, as a result, we continue to plow ahead in the wrong direction. Now, we were told at the start of the Ramaphosa administration that we had dodged a bullet in South Africa. Can you imagine what would have happened if the NDZ faction had got in? Because Mr. Ramaphosa had a wonderful reform agenda. If anybody in the ANC could crack this ideological mold, it must be this wonderful businessman who understood the market, who understood what international investors were looking for, who understood how to get the economy back on the right footing. And he certainly said all the right things. We heard about the New Dawn, and alongside him we saw brave fellow reformers, Pravin Gordhan, Tito Mboweni, who were surely going to help us steer the ship of South Africa bravely towards this new dawn. But almost 3 years now into this administration, there can be no more illusions about the so-called reformers. Because every time they go out, they're yanked back into formation by the enemies of growth. None of the promised reforms have materialized. And instead of a new dawn, we've been staring expectantly at the same old horizon, crossing our fingers and praying for a miracle. Our recent further downgrade into double junk status confirmed that the much vaunted reform agenda of the Ramaphosa presidency failed at its very first hurdle. Any talk of reform with his own party, any draft plan that put some of the issues on the table, is immediately shut down, and we're left with the same old Cold War approach to the national democratic revolution. And we've seen it. And Minister Mboweni, who seems to tweet a little bit more than Helen Zille does these days, shares things about the deep reforms that need to happen. He is very quickly pulled back into line by the people within his own party and his faction. Comrade Mboweni, that's not what the National Council resolved. That wasn't what was agreed at Nazareth. That's not the policy of the ANC. And so each and every one of these attempts to give birth to the reform agenda is aborted by the enemies of growth that sit within the governing party itself. So when the president stands on national television and excitedly tells us about his economic recovery plan, the smart thing now to do is to actually wait for the finance minister to table his budget before you break out the champagne. Because that's when you start to see, in clear, spectacular technicolor, the very big difference and the big gaping hole between what is said and what is done. That's why you see the contradictions between the president's soothing words and the realities of the governing party's worldview as expressed in its budget decisions. Our problem is that our government deals in the politics of optics. Saying the right thing and pretending to move in the right direction creates the illusion of action, and it buys you just enough time until the next installment of the crisis wipes out those promises and those commitments from memory. Who remembers Tito Mbowene's commitments around debt ceilings? Who remembers promises made on frontline services? Who remembers promises made on the huge jobs revolution that was about to be unleashed? And so we see the president promising us economic recovery plans, a president talking tough on gender-based violence, and speaking about fixing our schools and bringing the dignity of water and sanitation to more communities around the country. While in that very same week, his finance minister is making budget cuts to police, to school infrastructure, all to pay for bailouts to our state airline and the other state-owned entities. All that comforting talk is nothing but a pseudo-remedy. As Tony said to me one evening, what the president is offering us is aromatherapy, when what South Africa desperately needs is chemotherapy. But the good news, before you've all lost the will to live, but the good news is that amidst all this doom and gloom, we don't have to wait for the tripartite alliance to disintegrate before we, as the people of South Africa, can set our economy free. Just as the East Germans and the Soviets eventually put to bed the failed ideology that had kept them trapped in abject poverty for so long, we too can walk away from the ANC's doomed project. We too can choose to throw off the yoke of a suffocating state control and step into the 21st century, albeit a couple of decades late. And by we, I mean the people, voters, because that is the only way to do this. The ANC cannot change its spots. For those of you who have not read last week's Mail and Guardian, I'm not often a big puncher of the Mail and Guardian, there was a startling admission in an internal ANC document that the party had become so moribund that the chance of turning it around was virtually impossible. That's its own admission inside our own governing party. It cannot change its spots. And the sooner we disabuse ourselves of that notion, the sooner we can commit to the reforms that South Africa needs. The so-called reformist presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa was the best shot that the ANC have ever had, and yet it has fallen so short and has not come even close. So if the ANC won't let go of the ropes that are holding South Africa back, it has to be the people of South Africa who then let go of the ANC. And believe you me, many, many are ready to do so. I know the DA had a mixed bag of results during the recent by-elections, and we certainly didn't have the 2019 election that we hoped for. But when you look at the overall votes shed during the recent week of by-elections and in 2019, it's the ANC who was by some distance the biggest loser. A shallow reading of the by-election results shows that the DA had a net loss of 7 seats. And while this was rightly described as a setback for the party, it doesn't tell the full story. While we lost seats to, among others, Good, the Patriotic Alliance, the Freedom Front Plus, and Al-Jamar, under extremely difficult local sit conditions, and I must say, punished due to several faults of our own, our support grew among both black and white voters. In fact, our total loss of support in all the by-elections, where the DA, ANC, and EFF fielded candidates, was less than 1 percentage points from our 2019 levels. The ANC lost almost 8 percentage points. But significantly, one of the wards which we won off the ANC, one of the few opposition parties that's winning wards off the ANC, was deep in the rural Eastern Cape, in a place called Walter Sisulu Municipality, which lies in the very north of the Eastern Cape province, almost on the Free State border. The ward in question includes Burgersdorp, Imzamomshle, and a rural district towards the Gerib Dam. It was in the 2 voting districts of Imzamomshle that the DA made its biggest inroads, enabling us to take that ward off the ANC. Now, not much was written about this, but to us it was very, very significant. If black voters in the rural Eastern Cape ward could turn their backs on the ANC in favor of the DA, then it could happen anywhere. And it was always going to be a matter of when, not if, the struggle credentials of the ANC would eventually begin to fade. And the real-life issues that affect South Africans on the ground every day would overtake their historical allegiance to the governing party. And that's already happening. And it's a trend that is not going to be reversed. Liberation movements across the continent have shown us this time and time again. A lead role in the struggle only buys you a few decades. After that, you need to perform or you're out. And so the question we have to ask then, if the ANC is fading, what replaces it? If the ANC is facing the possibility of losing its majority in the course of the next election cycle, which is seeming more and more likely, where will the new majority in South Africa come from? And here the choice for voters comes down to two very clear and very distinct options. Do I still see a future for a united, diverse South Africa? Or is that dream no longer viable? And should I rather retreat back into a laager of racial, language, geographic, or religious uniformity? Now, there may be many options available to voters in terms of parties to choose from on the ballot paper, but the choice actually is about those two outcomes. Because every other major party in South Africa, apart from the DA, unashamedly flies the flag for one group of South Africans only, whether this is black South Africans, Afrikaners, Zulus, or Christians. As our economic situation worsens and tensions in society rise, the movement away from the center towards the more radical edges of the political spectrum will try and gain momentum. In difficult times, as we find ourselves now, it's really not that hard to appeal to people's fears and to then turn those fears into anger or hatred. And we're certainly seeing this across the world as the rise of identity politics and types of nationalism end up turning citizens against each other and against outsiders. Here at home, the recent ugly scenes in Brackenfell are a stark reminder of just how destructive this brand of us versus them really is. And that is why I'm very proud that our party has committed to building a united, non-racial and rational center in our politics. Because this is where the new majority in South Africa has to come from if we're going to have any chance of success. That is why our values and policies are written for all South Africans. Because we know that a majority brought together by a shared set of values and principles and a shared vision for our country is the only foundation to build a solid future. A majority built around a single identity, a single culture, a single race can never, ever achieve this. And that is why we proudly adopted the policy of non-racialism at our recent elective policy conference. Because we cannot fix the injustice perpetrated by the past by perpetuating the same divisions that caused the injustice in the very first place. In recent years, we haven't always honored this commitment. In our desperation to bring changes to metros like Johannesburg and Tshwane, we compromised on our values by making concessions to the EFF. We cannot do that again. The DA's plans, and indeed our country's future, don't lie with a party like the EFF. Our values and our commitment to democracy, to the rule of law, means that there is a red line that we cannot cross. The EFF is moving beyond that line. For the DA, there's only one criteria of success that really matters, and that is the lived experience of citizens where we govern. If we compromise on this to accommodate a party that doesn't share our belief in democracy and freedom, we will have given up everything that sets us apart. If we're given the opportunity to govern in a city or town, it has to be felt that there is a significant change in the way in which it felt like under the ANC to what it feels like under the DA. That change was undeniable in places like Nelson Mandela Bay from 2016 to 2018. And it's been almost entirely undone these past 2 years following the treacherous coup by the ANC, UDM, and EFF in Nelson Mandela Bay. But I'm happy to say that by all accounts, it looks like Nelson Mandela Bay will have a DA mayor and a DA-led coalition government again, hopefully in a matter of days or weeks. And that DA-led government's not going to sit around crying and complaining about everything that's happened the last 2 years. We're going to get out there and start to fix it, because that's what South Africa needs. That's all that matters, and that's everything that the DA should be known about. We have a similar opportunity in Tshwane to bring stability, accountability, and clean governance back to a city that has taken a beating since falling back into the hands of the ANC and its administrators. And what we do in these metros can become a blueprint for how we will build a new majority in South Africa. We will show that there is clear blue water between the DA and other parties on the spectrum. We will show that running clean governments and shutting down the patronage networks makes a noticeable difference to the lived experience and service delivery. We will show that a meritocracy beats cadre deployment every single day of the week. And we will show that the more power you take away from the incapable state and place in the hands of people, the more you free them up to live their lives and the way they want to. We need to show that by devolving more power to provinces, to local government, and giving local people more say over their lives really will make a difference. And we will show that a party that speaks for all, cares for all, and is a home for all is the only way forward for South Africa. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy. Please don't get me wrong. But it has to be done, because that is South Africa's only hope. In the meantime, we will continue to perform our job in Parliament as the official opposition. And the only way that we know how to do it, and that is relentlessly. We will continue to hold government to account on every single issue and continue to push for reforms that everyone, including those in the ANC, know South Africa desperately needs. But what we're not going to do is get into the ANC's factional fights. Now, you don't have to be a political analyst to recognize that Thursday's scheduled motion of no confidence in President Ramaphosa is part of a counterstrike by Ace Magashule faction through its proxy project called the African Transformation Movement, headed up by Jimmy Manyi and others. And Newton's third law of motion is very clear. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And it's no coincidence that this motion that was languishing for 4 months below the line in Parliament was suddenly pulled above the line to be debated in the House the moment the legal heat was pushed up and turned on against Ace Magashule. Now, we're not going to play any part in a war for control of the ANC, and we will not support this motion. Our 84 MPs were not elected to go and pick winners and losers in the ANC. They were elected to Parliament to hold government to account and to pass legislation that will improve the lives of the people who have sent us there. And that is what we intend to do. So while the ANC and its proxies slug it out for control, we want to give President Ramaphosa a warning, as well as offer him an opportunity. President Ramaphosa, bring your reform agenda and table it in Parliament so that we can help you pass it. We've made this offer before, and I want to repeat it again, because the President is fast running out of time. The enemies of growth are sitting around him, and as the heat has turned up on them, they too will start to move. They're going to do everything they can to scupper any reform agenda that the President would want to bring to the House. But the truth of the matter is, if the President was just to reach across the aisle, he'll find probably the majority that he needs to get his reform agenda on the table, firewalled, brought into law, and enacted by Parliament. Let him bring his reforms, and let him bring the votes of those in the ANC who back the reform agenda, and we will help him to pass them. He knows he can't trust half his party, but he doesn't have to. But the reality is that that window of opportunity is closing more and more every single day as these factions jostle for position. The president has to know that he has a target on his back, and the sands of time are running through the hourglass very quickly. So he must use this window of opportunity now and put the country first and put his party second. That could be the very first step in South Africa away from decades of poor policy choices and even worse leadership. And it certainly would be the first step towards building a new majority in the center of our politics. A majority focused, for the very first time ever, on the needs of the people rather than the greed of the leaders. I think that would be really something. Thank you.